Welcome to the Orleen S. Walker Institute of Politics and Public Service. Today, we're presenting the drying of the Great Salt Lake, and we're going to learn about the impacts and what we can do to prevent this from happening going forward. Our host for today is Dr. Julie Rich. Dr. Julie Rich is the interim dean for the Weber State University's College of Social and Behavioral Science. Dr. Rich is an award-winning professor at Weber State and has taught here for over 25 years and recently has entered the world of administration in being our dean. She has a strong belief in getting students into the field and has organized high-impact community-engaged projects for students in Africa, South America, and the South Sea Islands to help alleviate poverty and to promote education for women and children. She is passionate about education and continues to involve students in her research on world deserts and in paleoclimatology. Dr. Rich has a wealth of international experience, having visited over 100 countries and lived abroad for over 9 years. Due to her global experience, Dr. Rich is consulted at the United Nations in Geneva. She has received her undergraduate degree from Weber State, her master's degree from University of Utah, and her doctorate from the University of Oxford in England. She is widely published in peer-reviewed journals, and she is a recipient of the H. Aldous Dixon Award, the Hemingway Faculty Excellence and Collaborative Awards, Red Cross International Hero Award, the Linquist Award, and the Crystal Crest Master Teaching Award. Wow, what a great career and a great person we have here at Weber State. Welcome, Julie. Thank you, and good luck with the show.
Thanks, Guy. I appreciate that introduction, and welcome to our forum today, the drying of the Great Salt Lake. We have three exciting panelists who are joining us today, and they're leaders in their particular areas of interest. Mr. Tage Flint, Dr. Carla Trentelman, and Representative Tim Hawks. Today, we're discussing a very important topic about our distinctive lake that inhabits our West Desert. Most of the precipitation that falls on our Earth makes its way to the ocean. But around the world, there are these unique areas where the drainage is captured in a basin and it never meets the ocean. These basins are called endorheic basins, and the lakes that inhabit them are called terminal lakes. Other terminal lakes besides the Great Salt Lake include the Caspian and Aral Seas on the Asian continent, Lake Eyre in Australia, Lake Chad in Africa, and Lake Urmia in Iran, almost a twin to our own Great Salt Lake. That's just to name a few. All of these lakes, including our own Great Salt Lake, are sensitive to environmental changes. So I'm very pleased to move on to our topic, the drying of the Great Salt Lake. And our program will go as follows. Each panelist will speak, and there'll be a question and answer period following. And at the very end of our forum, we'll open it up to comments and additional questions. So our first speaker today is Mr. Tage Flint. And Mr. Flint has dealt extensively with water rights, irrigation company leadership, and municipal water supply for over 30 years. Presently, he's a general manager and CEO of Weber Basin Water Conservancy District located in northern Utah. Weber Basin Water manages 7 major dams and reservoirs and 3 hydropower generation plants, while conveying water through hundreds of miles of canals, pipelines, and aqueducts in northern Utah. Mr. Flint is active in his local community and industry and serves on a myriad of different boards and committees. Most notably, he's the chair of the National Water Resources and Municipal Caucus, president of the Utah Defense Alliance Board of Directors. He is on the Davis and Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce Board of Governors and the Utah Drinking Water Board and the Utah Water Users Association Board. He also is a Utah National Guard honorary colonel and a Hill Air Force Base Wingman of the Year honoree. We are very pleased to have Mr. Flint here. He's a professional engineer with degrees in civil engineering from the University of Utah and an MBA from Western Governors University. We're honored to have him as one of our panelists for today's event. So, Mr. Tage Flint, we're looking forward to your presentation, present and future demands on our Wasatch Front water supply.
Thank you, Julie, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. An honor to always be affiliated with Weber State University, which I've appreciated all my life and attended there to getting a minor math degree there before moving to engineering school at another university. But I've also put my two sons through Weber State in advance of their advanced degrees as well, and just couldn't appreciate the university anymore and what they bring to the community and the value they bring to their students. It's second to none. So thank you for having me. It's my pleasure. I will attempt now to share my screen, and hopefully you all can see that now. Just by way of introduction, Weber Basin Water Conservancy District, which I manage, encompasses 5 counties in northern Utah. Mostly it encompasses the Weber River drainage and the Ogden River drainage, 2 tributary rivers to the Great Salt Lake. As you can see there, Olive Davis and Weber County is part of Box Elder County. Ogden Valley and the areas above on the Ogden River system, Morgan County, and then Summit County on out to Wyoming, where the headwaters of the Weber River begin. As you can see there, we cover a large area of northern Utah, and importantly, a couple of the rivers that feed into the Great Salt Lake, and certainly serve the communities that are on the shores of the Great Salt Lake, north of Salt Lake City. And no surprise to anyone, I suppose, at this point. If I can now just advance my slides, we'll be all right. No surprise to anyone. See that screen okay, everyone still? And no surprise to everyone, the population growth in Utah I apologize, I've lost my screen. Julie, I'll jump right off and then right back on again.
All right, Tage, we have a few difficulties with the presentation, so we'll try to get that working, and maybe Jordan can help us. He's our IT specialist. We could see your presentation on our end, Tage, if that's of any help.
Great, thank you.
While we're waiting for Tage, we'll use this time to introduce our next speaker who'll be coming up from Tage, and that's going to be Dr. Carla Coons-Trentelman, and she's an environmental and natural resource sociologist who's taught at Weber State for over 10 years. We're thrilled to have her as part of our faculty in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Her research interests focus on natural resources and the environment, particularly issues related to the Great Salt Lake. Matter of fact, she's wearing her brine shrimp scarf today for the event. She recently published in an article in the book, and I have a copy of that book here. It's called The Great Salt Lake Biology, and her chapter is relationships between humans and Great Salt Lake dynamics of change. And we'll be hearing from Carla in just a little bit, and we'll continue with her bio when Tage is finished and we've completed the question and answer. So Tage, you ready to go?
Almost, Julie, I really apologize.
No, no worries. We're living in the world of Zoom and these things happen.
We'll try this one more time.
And we can see your screen clearly.
Great. How about now? See the map?
The PowerPoint, we're seeing your inbox, and the PowerPoint hasn't loaded yet.
Okay. How about now?
Looks like you're just sharing the window that has your inbox open. You'll need to exit out of screen sharing and share your window that has your PowerPoint opened up.
Thank you.
When it
And-
asks you which screen you'd like to share, just make sure. Yeah, there you go.
There we go. Tage, it looks like the map of the counties is up and we're ready to go.
We'll make an attempt here. Thank you. Utah population growth, no surprise to anyone, is going up exponentially. You can see here that presently at 2020, we're just over 3 million folks in the state, and with a projection of it growing much higher, nearing 6 million by 2060. That no surprise to anyone. The way I like to characterize this is we're adding the city of Layton in its total population to the state's population every single year, and even growing beyond that over the next few decades. And so they all need to drink of water. They all need a water supply for their health and public good, as well as their landscapes and whatever other things that they want for their quality of life. I think it's important if we just look for a moment of where all the water goes that falls on the state's ground, if you will. If any rain or snow that falls on the land mass of Utah is characterized here, and you can see there that about 89% of the precipitation ends up going into the ground and back into the natural systems and into the groundwater recharge of the state. And so when we talk about water use in Utah, we're really talking about those colored, smaller pie-shaped pieces on this wheel that are characterized by about 4.5% of all the water that falls on the earth here in Utah is used by agriculture. You can see here less than 1% is being used by municipal and industrial water. And then you can see that there's another block of water there that could be used for potential supplies of the population going forward. And then you can also see that the wetlands and reservoirs and net outflows are characterized there in smaller amounts as well. That last category of net outflow includes the flow that goes into the Great Salt Lake, which is the topic today. As far as aerials go of the lake is highly variable up and down. It has been historically throughout before the time that men were settled here, and certainly while we've been living here, it goes up and down quite drastically. On the left-hand side, you can see the stream flow inputs that come into the lake, and you can see how widely varied they are from one year to the next. And that's just part of that part of it is part of the hydrology that we all experience on an annual basis here living in northern Utah, and the lake gets those same effects imposed upon it. The white outline of the highest shoreline elevation of 4207, you can see there where the lake was the largest. That was just 30 years ago. And now in July of 2015, we hit low there. You can see where the water is shown on the picture. That just gives you an idea of the wide range that we experience even in modern history of the lake. And during that time, from the white line to the blue water there, diversions on the rivers coming in have not changed that much. In fact, hardly at all, which illustrates the lake is going to go up and down with whatever steady state you might see in stream flows coming in. Human impacts to the Great Salt Lake are many, and you can see here where the largest user of water that's diverted from streams that come into the lake is agriculture. And this is illustrated in about 11 feet of impact to the Great Salt Lake that was studied by the Utah State University and the University of Utah. So at any one time, the lake is around 11 feet lower than it would be if nobody was doing anything to any rivers running into the lake. That 11 feet is taken up by the largest piece there represented by agriculture. And then, as you can see there, the rest in municipal industrial water is impacting about 1.3 feet, mineral extraction about 1.4 feet, and so on. So it's important to note that why the lake's down and who's impacting it the most as we go forward. Now, we have to be careful to not just lay this at the feet of agriculture, because agriculture in turn is returning a lot of the water back to the river system on return flows from their fields. And that is a very complex matter that we don't have time today to talk about, but we will in the future. Potential future impacts on the lake as we see it is increased urban demand as that population continues to move into Utah. And by the way, most of them will move into northern Utah and along the Wasatch Front and the Wasatch back. We'll see an increasing urban demand that goes with that. And we're going to have to be careful to be sure that we mitigate and do not impact the Great Salt Lake any further than it already has, and maybe even enhance it along the way. That might be a little bit different than what you've heard from water managers in the past, but I can assure you that water managers in northern Utah now have an eye to the lake at all times and have an interest in being sure that it stays healthy and maybe even enhanced over the next decades, as opposed to further dropping it down. Improper conversion of agriculture to municipal water is one that we'll have to watch very closely. It's one we're engaged in all the time. And what that means is agricultural water, as farms go out, new uses come in, and we want to be able to apply that same water to the new use. But in the process, we have to be careful that that water that was returning to the lake through agriculture applications still is allowed to return to the lake under the municipal application. Climate change, we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. And but it will in fact impact evaporation on the lake and inflows coming into the lake. Water development projects, the one that we'll talk about here in a moment in northern Utah certainly could have an impact on the lake that we'll need to mitigate. Also, additional mineral extraction. As you saw there right now, mineral extraction is contributing to the lake's lower elevation as much as municipal water usage is. And if that was to expand, then again, another impact. Water efficiency and conservation. That seems to be an odd one to list here, but I can tell you through our experience here at the district that water conservation in and of itself is where we need to go. We need to drive our per capita usage down. At the same time, water conservation can impact that water that returns to the lake after this first use. And if we become very, very efficient in the water that we divert in using it over and over again, we may very well impact the lake along the way. We're very excited about the fact that we just completed a study here at the district about the climate vulnerability to our rivers specifically. It's one of the first micro looks at a river system in the Western United States to see what climate change impacts we will experience. We've taken it that seriously and we want to know. We try not to talk much here about attribution as to why climate change is happening, because we're from the science end of it, we just need to know what to react to next. One of the most often asked questions of me is, what about climate change? What is climate change going to do to your water supply? And what I've been known to respond with is that the climate change is not a quantified noun. It's not a thing that we know as much as you might hear it discussed in public. What we do know through our studies, and this was a very extensive and complicated study that we just completed, are a couple things. One is there is a high confidence from the study and from the models that were run that there will be increased temperatures in our area in northern Utah. We have a medium confidence that there will be more precipitation, but not much more than 50-50. But it looks, the models are trending towards a little more precipitation in northern Utah than we have had in the past. And we have a low confidence on what the impacts to our water supply and storage are going to be along the way, because the snow rain mix and the other things in that prism will certainly vary, but the models are not doing well right now in predicting what that might be. And so we will continue on with our planning here to be sure that the water supply that's relied upon so heavily by our citizens is still here in the next decades. But we're going to have to take into the fact that it will be warmer, and it's very likely that the precipitation will be higher, and that some of that will come in rain as opposed to snow. The Bear River Development Act, the much talked about Bear River project for northern Utah, was planned and foreseen by the State Division of Water Resources many decades ago. In 1991, the state legislature passed the act that allowed for surface waters on the Bear River to be diverted and treated and put into municipal use along the Wasatch Front, starting in Cache County through Box Elder, Weber, Davis, and Salt Lake counties would all be recipients of that water. We know that this is going to take through, or we put through a very rigorous environmental process long before we ever even get to final design of a project like this. And we know that it's going to be incredibly expensive, incredibly controversial, and will have to be taken very responsibly and very slowly. Why do we think it can be taken slowly? It's because the water demands look like this in northern Utah, at least for my district, where you can see the dark blue and medium blue line, solid areas on this graph represent the existing water supply. And only the green and the light blue that say Bear River on top are the next water supplies. If you follow the solid red line along there with the ultimate in water conservation that we think we can achieve versus the dotted red line, which is the demand going forward without conservation, we're likely to fall between those two lines somewhere. If you follow those up to the Bear River project, you can see there that we don't project now that we need any water from the Bear River until 2050 or after. Well, that's good news. It's good news is that we're willing to push that as far out and only plan for it now and preserve the options for it now, as opposed to trying to build it or even do the environmental process for it. That allows us time to talk about mitigation and time to realize the actual population that we're trying to feed. And then lastly, we have a lot of input from a lot of different groups and a lot of different folks. And my experience is that we experience a lot of input from some folks who have maybe one or two or three of these bubbles in mind when we're approached. And what we've found is that water districts that we find ourselves right in the middle of a very complex issue of how to deal with water supply going forward. And they include health of our watersheds, not only the Great Salt Lake, but there's a watershed above it that needs to be healthy and strong. And we work all the time in forest management and are going to increase our efforts in forest management going forward. Recreation, our reservoirs are used immensely. If you've ever been to Pineview Reservoir on a Saturday, you know that recreation is a big component of some of our facilities and what we provide as a service here in the state, and it needs to be preserved. Population growth, we know the population is going to grow. We know more people are going to move into our area, and we know that our 700,000 folks that we serve right now are going to be 1.5 million in the next 4 decades. Water conservation, we know that we need to drive further down our per capita use of water and be more responsible with it. And that has a lot to do with landscapes and a lot to do with how much water we apply to our outdoor applications in our yards and gardens. We know we can do better. Public health and safety, we are the largest drinking water provider in northern Utah. We analyze your water hourly, your drinking water, to be sure that when it's delivered to your cities, who then take it and retail it to you, that it's safe and healthy. And we do a tremendous job there without any of the problems you might see in the news coming from the Midwest or other places in the country or world. Fisheries, we do projects all the time with Trout Unlimited and others who are interested in maintaining the blue ribbon trout fishery and other fisheries in our reservoirs and rivers. Agriculture, still a big industry in our area, and the production of food and fiber is not to be trifled with as we see it. And we still need to make sure that we maintain agricultural water for as long as they want it. Our economy, we think, is fueled by water supply. And the day that the water is not available, our economy will go the same route. The Great Salt Lake Health is one I mentioned earlier that we take seriously here, and that I grew up on the shores of the Great Salt Lake, and I can assure you we have no interest in seeing it recede any further than it already has. And like I said, maybe even mitigating back some of that. And then endangered species in rivers, and that includes plants, bugs, fish, you name it, all those things, because we are a federal project sponsor here in northern Utah. We have a responsibility to maintain and keep species not on the endangered species list. And that's why I think, and why I say that we are in the middle right here, with all of these issues having to be part of our complex analysis and our matrix going forward. Okay, I think with my snafu at the beginning, Julie, I'm at my time, and apologize for that earlier on. Certainly open for any questions you may have.
Thanks, Tage, for that very informative and insightful presentation that you gave on the Great Salt Lake. I wanted to remind our guests who are listening in that you can put your questions in the Q&A, and we will share those with our panelists. And while the Q&A is being populated, maybe I can just ask you a question, Tage. As you mentioned, there's roughly 88% of water that is being consumed in Utah by farms and agriculture ranches. And you mentioned that we're converting some of that surplus agricultural water for municipal use, of course, but how do you work the plan for that water to return back to the Great Salt Lake? How is that actually working?
Right. It's a great question. It's a complex one, and it has all to do with where we ask it along the river system. And I'll give you an example. If we were talking to a farmer in the Camas Valley, which is very high up on the Weber River system, some of the highest elevation farms we have, we are hopeful that he's incredibly inefficient in his farming watering practices, and because what we expect him to do and rely on him doing is to apply water to his fields and expect at least 50% of that water not to be consumed by the plant, and rather return back to the river system, and thus enhancing the flows going downstream for the next appropriator on the stream to use part of that as his supply. And that's the way the water law and the doctrine works here in the state of Utah. To your question about what returns to the Great Salt Lake, there are a couple of big components. One is certainly the agricultural return flow as we talk about the Wasatch Front. Then we would expect that efficiency of the farmer to be still to the point where he's returning about 50% of what he applies to his farm, and that water then goes directly to the lake, whether over the surface or through the shallow groundwater prism, one or the other. Then the other piece of efficiency that we want to talk about always is the municipal use and how that water returns to the wastewater plants and the stormwater systems, and directly is piped from there to the rivers and or to the lake itself. And that's a complicated mass balance, if you will, of water sources coming back to the lake that we need to be better aware of and model more than we have in the past, which we are starting to do now. We want to know what the inputs to the lake are so that we may mitigate any changes to them.
Thanks, Tage. There's been 3 questions come in from our audience. One from Justin Owen, and Justin's saying, I'm curious about agricultural efficiency. What can the typical hobby farmer that uses flood irrigation do to improve their system?
Right, great question, particularly for the hobby farmer and the large gardener, if you will, that have large gardens. The idea would be a couple things. One would be that the water we apply to our gardens and hobby farms ought to first come from what we can store locally from rainwater, and there's a state limit, a law limit on what you can do there. We always encourage that first, but secondly, and more so, the water that you apply there, if you can do it in areas that are tighter row crops and root delivery systems as opposed to that of a sprinkler or even flood irrigation through a row. So drip systems, as much as they are practical, is what we will encourage for higher efficiencies.
Thanks, Tage. Another one from Jeff Glover. A couple of years ago, our secondary water was metered. Has this reduced secondary water usage? If not, what are the next actions planned to drive water use reduction?
Great question. Northern Utah, so Davis and Weber and Box Elder counties certainly are some of the highest per capita users of secondary water, as we call it, in the United States. This is very unique to Northern Utah, where we have a second pipe in every road almost up here that has an untreated water source that goes to your outdoor applications. So, and then the second pipe in the ground is your drinking water pipe that goes to your indoor applications. That's very unique. You don't see it too many places other than here. And but what it brings is an opportunity to apply that untreated water that doesn't cost as much money to treat, of course, to the yards. At the same time, it has some debris in it. And because it had debris in it, for many decades, it could not be metered. Any meter that we put that had a physical wheel movement in it would plug up, and the meter was useless. The technology has really changed over the last decade and a half now, to where we have flow-through meters that don't have any moving parts, that we can now measure the water efficiently and safely. We have our district now has put in about 11,000 of those meters on individual applications on the retail basis. And to answer the question, we have seen remarkable results from that. Without changing how we charge for the water each year, we have just provided a ton more information to the user. And now the user knows how much they're using on a daily basis. They can go on their portal at any time, hour by hour, and see how much water they're using. And just that information being given to the hands of the user has reduced our water use on the secondary water side about 20%. So a user that has a meter versus a user does not have a meter, we're expecting 20+% difference in their water use over the year. It's significant. The most significant water conservation tool we've applied so far.
Very good. Thanks for that. We've got about 3 more minutes, so I'm going to select maybe 1 or 2 of the other questions now, but we'll reserve the others that have come in for the end of our forum and try to get everyone's question answered. One is in from John Browning, and he asked, with so much agricultural runoff, do you not get sediment and phosphate pollution to rivers with impact on insect and fish life?
Yeah, it's a good question. We certainly have agricultural applications and fields in every valley of the watersheds of our 2 rivers. Here's the good news. The good news is we do monitor heavily the nitrates and phosphates and other fertilizer and agricultural product-based material elements and compounds in our reservoirs. And it is true that those compounds in our reservoirs will add to algal growth. Algae will be present in those reservoirs more so if they have the nutrients to grow on. We have significantly reduced, and when I say we, really the farmers have significantly reduced their loading of those materials in our streams over the last 4 decades. The first one was animal feeding operations have been cleaned up tremendously so that the manure and other operations are not bringing the nitrates and other nutrients to the water source any longer. And then the applications of fertilizers are much more efficient now than they used to be. Most of our farmers now are applying a different dosage of those materials to each acre depending on what the soil type is. That results in a lesser load coming over the whole farm. Then the good news here is that we are in a one-shot system, as we call it, where the snow falls on the Uinta mountain range and then later on the Wasatch Mountain range and runs off one time through the river systems, through the reservoirs and down into the Great Salt Lake without it running through another series of farms and yet another series of farms or even another series of years before it goes to its terminal ocean. Because of that, the concentrations do not add up like they do in other river systems in the United States. So we're very fortunate here in Northern Utah that we get that flushing, if you will, on an annual basis.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Tage. We have a few more questions that are in the question and answer section. We'll reserve those towards the end of the forum, but right now we'd like to move on and listen to the presentation by Carla Trendelman. We had started with her bio, and we'll go to page 2 of her bio now. So we know that she's published recently in the book, The Great Salt Lake Biology, A Terminal Lake in a Time of Change, and that's edited by B.K. Baxter and J.K. Butler. They're two scientists that are working quite intensively on the Great Salt Lake. And Carla has been teaching environmental and natural resources, sociology courses, and sometimes the sociology of water among the many other courses that she teaches for Weber State University. She's an alum from Weber State, 1982. She completed her PhD in philosophy from Utah State University in 2009. Carla does have time for fun, she says, and she enjoys spending time with her husband, Charlie, who many of us know, working for many years for the Ogden Standard Examiner. And she spends time with her family, and she has 4 amazing grands, as she calls them. She delights in birding, especially at the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge and other areas around the Great Salt Lake. And we are very pleased and honored to have Carla with us today. Dr. Trendelman, we turn the time over to you, and we're very excited for your presentation.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up my slides. And there are 2 of those grands right there in front of us. As a sociologist, and just to clarify, that PhD was actually in sociology from Utah State. As a sociologist, I'm going to focus on the effects of humans and our ecosystem of the drying or desiccation of Great Salt Lake, including what we stand to lose, which is important for us to think about. Back in 2009, I had the opportunity to conduct some research on how folks who live closest to the lake, within a mile to 1.5 miles of the lake, see the lake, including a survey with 380 participants. 290 of them answered an open-ended question asking what Great Salt Lake meant to them. And the things that they came up with included the views and sunsets, recreation opportunities, the diversity of birds and wildlife that are associated with the lake, social and community aspects connected to the lake, including family connections to the lake, and the uniqueness of Great Salt Lake. Those things were all important to these folks. And Great Salt Lake is important to all of us in Utah for the economic contributions to the state, if for no other reason. Mineral extraction, the brine shrimp harvest, recreation, and other economic services provided by Great Salt Lake and its ecosystem bring in $1.32 billion annually, including $375 million in labor income, with 7,700 full and part-time jobs annually. Now, to quote from the 2019 report to the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, this vitally important resource with its surrounding wetlands is, however, threatened by long-term declining water levels that could severely and adversely impact the ecological integrity of the lake and the economic viability and quality of life for those who rely on the lake, including those who live in the vicinity, including us. So what does this look like? Well, in 1972, Great Salt Lake was pretty close to its historic average at about 4,200 feet above sea level. Now, importantly, at that level, Great Salt Lake is 75 miles long and 28 miles wide. It covers 1,700 square miles. I like to just remind us of that. That's where the name came from. Pretty great lake. Well, in 1963, we set the lake set its historic low level and then hit that again in 2015. And that low level was 4191, so 4,191 feet above sea level. And at that point, the lake covered only 950 square miles. Okay, so only a 9-foot difference in elevation meant 750 square miles less coverage. And importantly, there's just a 9-foot difference between the average and the historic low elevations of the lake. That's really important to keep in mind. Now, the slide on the right is from 2016. I was pretty much tied to that old record, that historic low. And just to give you a sense of the current state, yesterday, the elevation of Great Salt Lake was 4191.9. So we're still looking at a very, very low lake. Now, 2011, the lake was already pretty dry, as you can see by this aerial shot of Antelope Island and Farmington Bay here. But in 2016, you can hardly even call it a bay. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the desiccation of this lake. Now, to use the same slide that Tate used a little bit earlier, in 2016, just under 50% of the lake bed was exposed, with some areas of the lake in even worse shape than that. So what does the desiccation of Great Salt Lake look like in terms of consequences? This great graphic comes from a report that was prepared for the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council on the potential costs of declining water levels in Great Salt Lake. And we see here from the right, these categories here, those costs to the ecosystem, right? And these are the kinds of things that we would expect from lower lake levels. But it's really important to keep in mind that there are increased economic costs with each of these things as well, right? So for example, more land bridges to the islands means more management costs, and habitat loss leads to lost opportunities for birders and hunters, and importantly, the money that they bring to local communities. And of course, anything that affects the brine shrimp affects the brine shrimp industry. But then also recreation costs, as the ability to do these pastimes diminishes, pastimes like birding, hunting, boating, and now we have to walk further and further just to float in the lake. Additionally, it affects other industries, like, for example, mineral extraction. I used to think that the mineral extraction folks would actually like lower lake levels because then there's higher concentrations of salt. But it actually turns out that it costs them more because of reduced access and because of how all of their infrastructure is set up. And so it ends up leading to additional costs for the mineral extraction industry as well. And then in addition to all of those kinds of things, we have increased dust. The more exposed lake bed there is, the more potential there is for lake dust being in the air, which then brings up local public health concerns. Now, in other places, exposed lake beds have created public health hazards, as fine dust from them can create dust storms, often with high concentrations of chemicals. And that's been associated with a number of problems and health issues. Other lakes that have become desiccated worldwide, for example, the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, Lake Urmia in Iran, the Salton Sea and Owens Lake in California. All of those places have seen health effects that have included increased asthma attacks, respiratory and lung diseases, infections, eye problems, increased hospitalizations and emergency room visits for children with asthma and other respiratory problems, plus just routine public health impacts from dust storms with both PM10 and PM2.5. So again, talking about a lot of lung problems and the potential for problems related to that. The exposed lake bed of Owens Lake in California became one of the largest sources of particulate matter in the United States as Owens Lake became more desiccated. Now, Great Salt Lake is already contributing to our current dust loads here. And according to the dust studies, that's actually even more so in our neck of the woods here in northern Utah than down near Salt Lake, just because of the ways that the wind blows and the air flows and such. The current estimates, potential health costs from dust from a shrinking Great Salt Lake could rise to between 6.6 million and 22.3 million per year. So those are pretty substantial health concerns, especially given our air quality concerns that already exist in northern Utah. Now, dust storms from the exposed lake bed can also risk property values. For example, the Salton Sea in California has had tremendous effects on their local property values because of all of the dust storms. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind here is that the properties closest to Great Salt Lake were being affected by salt and lake dust long before the lake got this low. In fact, when I conducted my research back in 2007 and 2009, the lake neighbors were already talking about damage to their property, to their cars, to their gardens and such from the lake dust and from the high quantities of salt in the air. Dust from exposed beds of terminal lakes can also increase the salt in soils, affecting agricultural output. This happened to a high degree near the Aral Sea. So these are some of the kinds of things that we can anticipate that we've seen in these other lake systems where the lakes have gotten desiccated, primarily due to other kinds of use. Now, in terms of the economy, it's really important to keep in mind that the cost of desiccation would actually be higher than just the losses of the money to the economy that's currently provided by Great Salt Lake. The potential costs could be as high as 1.69 billion to 2.17 billion per year, and over 6,500 job losses. So there's a whole lot of potential costs from continuing to go the way that we're currently going with Great Salt Lake. And that isn't even to mention the losses of these other benefits that neighbors of Great Salt Lake talked about, the cultural aspects, being able to enjoy the lake, doing the same thing with their kids and even their grandkids that their parents or grandparents did with them. Having a sense of identity and pride that they live next to this important lake that you can see on all the maps and even a globe. That was something that the neighbors of Great Salt Lake talked about with pride. You know, as they were traveling around, people would ask them, well, where do you live? And they'd say, have you ever noticed this lake in Utah on the map or even on the globe? And of course, everybody would say, yeah, well, I live right next to that lake. And that was a sense of importance to them. The smaller the lake gets, the less chance there is for that to be a sense of pride. Now, my single biggest concern here is that Great Salt Lake's elevation is already low. It has been for the last decade and a half. Excuse me, my lights think I've disappeared. There we go. So the lights are going out on Great Salt Lake. That's a sad thing. So anyway, Great Salt Lake's elevation is already low and has been for the last decade and a half, nearing that historical level. The lake is already experiencing these reductions now before there's any additional rise in population or further development of lake-bound water, and yet climate change, which will not only affect Great Salt Lake sources of water, it will also affect humans' sources of water, further exacerbating tensions over water. So those are my concerns. Here are the references for those works that I referred to, and that's what I have. Any questions for me?
Carla, thank you for that very poignant and enlightening presentation. And may I remind our guests who are joining us today to put your questions in the into the Q&A. And while we're waiting for those to come in, let me just ask you a question. You had referred to the RLC as a kind of, well, it's an ecological disaster, and formerly the 4th largest lake in the world. And I was just wondering, the reason why it dried up was due to diversions and the exposed lake sediments that were dried up. They were breathing, the local people were breathing this dust, and that led to cancers, respiratory diseases, anemia, miscarriages, TB, and a variety of other health issues. These people became sick on those exposed lake sediments. And do we know what kind of chemicals and pesticides and other toxins that have been allowed to flow into the lake? And what do you foresee as are the critical health risks that we could have in the near future as Great Salt Lake dries and the wind excavates the lake sediments?
Those are really great questions, Julie. We know a lot about what's gone into the lake. And, you know, here it's really important to keep in mind that Great Salt Lake is at the bottom of this basin. That's what makes it a terminal lake. And so everything that water flows through ends up in the lake. We know that we have high concentrations of mercury. We know we have high concentrations of selenium, as well as a lot of other kinds of chemicals. Thus far, the dust studies that have been done looking at the dust loads in northern Utah and in Utah as a whole have found two really interesting things. One is that the majority of our dust actually is related to the lakes, to now Great Salt Lake, but also we have a long history of dust from Lake Bonneville and from Lake Sevier. And so the majority of dust that we have around is from those lakes. However, thus far, what we found is that the majority of the chemical pollutants in our dust here in northern Utah is actually from the cities and from industry, not from the lake yet. Now, that doesn't mean that won't change. There's certainly the potential for the lake to contribute nasty stuff, nasty chemical stuff. And that would increase risks for things like, for example, cancer and other kinds of illnesses. But it's really important to keep in mind that just the dust particles themselves, that particulate matter, can can create respiratory problems, lung problems, lung disease, asthma, exacerbation of asthma, those kinds of concerns. And so that's just a really generalized kind of answer to your question, but it's something that we'll definitely need to continue watching very closely.
Thanks, Carla, for answering that. We've got some questions that have come in from Carrie France. Carla, in my experience, folks are becoming more aware of the potential negative consequences of a dried up lake. Have you seen this in a measurable way with the people you've talked to since your last survey? And do you believe people value the lake more than they did before?
You know, I'm going to talk about that at a couple of different levels. I really can't talk about it in terms of the folks who live closest to the lake, because I've not done any kind of follow-up research out there. Unfortunately, once I started teaching, I quit having time to do that level of research. So I can't address it at that level, but I can say that in terms of the public conversation, there's been tremendous increase in interest related to the lake and concern, I think, related to the lake, compared to what things were like when I first started playing around with looking at the lake sociologically. One of the things that really blew me away when I was working on my dissertation work was that at that point in time, no one had ever studied the economic contributions of the lake. There were a couple of folks from the media who had done some calculations and come up with some numbers. But when I was working on my dissertation, I actually even got in touch with the governor's office and all the state level people, and they're like, no, we haven't ever looked at that, And so one of the things that I argued for with my dissertation was that, folks, we need to look at this, because it seems to me like there's a lot of economic activity going on with the lake, and we really should be aware of what that is. And Friends of Great Salt Lake started making those suggestions, and they ran a pilot study, and the state of Utah decided, yeah, we really need to take a look at that. And in 2012, the major economic study of the lake came out, which definitely helped elevate interest in the lake, because now it was quantifiable. What the lake was bringing in was quantifiable. What are the economic interests, the economic investment that we should be making to make sure that that the lake could continue to provide those economic resources became a lot more clear after we had that research. And that's just one example. There's been a good number of studies that have been happening in the last 15 years, including some of the ones that I just cited. We've seen far more interest at every level of the state governance. And I think that we've also seen a lot more interest at the level of county governance by the counties that have chunks of Great Salt Lake that are part of their counties. So those kinds of conversations have definitely increased, and we've seen a lot of progress because of that. We now have some really important folks from a diversity of areas who are coming together to talk about the lake and about, okay, so what do we do with these concerns? What do we do about the elevation? What do we do about the water? What do we do about even things like Phragmites and, all of those kinds of issues. So I think that there's been tremendous increase in those kinds of areas.
Very good. One last question, Carla. And it has to do with the lake sediments that are excavated and carried by the wind to our snowpack that you had talked about in your presentation, and how those sediments have a tendency to darken that normally reflective surface, accelerating snowmelt. How is this impacting the ski industry? And is there a conversation with this nearly $1.5 billion industry that Utah relies on?
I know that those conversations are taking place. Those dust studies that were actually conducted by the U of U, the other ones that I referred to were conducted by BYU. The dust studies looking at the effect on the snowmelt and the snowpack were conducted by the U. And part of the concern there is that not only for the ski industry, but also in terms of if the snowpack isn't doing the job that the ecosystem needs it to do to keep the reservoirs replenished, to keep the flow running and those kinds of things, that really messes with a whole lot of the ways that we do water here in Utah, and a whole lot of the ways that Tage does water here in Utah, for example. So the dust on the snowpack that does lead to it melting much faster is definitely a concern. I can't speak to it more specifically because that is not my branch of science, but I know those conversations are happening.
And it's good that they are. So we're happy about that. Carla, thank you so much for your presentation. And we'll move on to our next panelist right now, and that is Representative Tim Hawks. We're so pleased that he's joined us today and is part of our illustrious group of individuals who are joining us. Representative Hawks holds an undergraduate degree in political science from BYU. That's that university that's to the south of us. I think their colors are blue and white, but we're purple and white. We really bleed purple here. But the law degree from Columbia University. After law school, he clerked for a federal district judge in Baltimore, Maryland, and then went to work for Sidley Austin in Washington, D.C., and in Tokyo, Japan, where he practiced civil litigation and appellate constitutional law. And he mentions that in a Green Acres move, and I had to ask him about that, and Becky Stromberg broke out in song to remind me of the sitcom that it went along with. He returned to Utah in 2004, thank goodness, to take a job with the conservation group Trout Unlimited to work on water law and policy. Currently, he serves as general counsel for the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative, which keeps him engaged in water issues professionally. He was first elected to the House in 2014, and he currently serves on the House Business and Labor Committee, the House Natural Resources Committee, and in House leadership as chair of the House Rules Committee. Many of the bills he runs focus on natural resource law and policy, particularly water. And in his free time, which I'm sure is all too scarce these days, he enjoys writing, photography, cooking, hiking, and fly fishing. Welcome, Representative Hawks, and we're so thrilled for what you bring to our forum today, and we're very excited to hear your presentation.
Thanks, Julie, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. Let me try to share my screen here, because who doesn't need a PowerPoint presentation early afternoon here? Okay, can folks see that? Give me a thumbs up if you can see what can be done to save Great Salt Lake. Thank you, Tage. So thinking back just briefly in terms of the run of the show, Tage really talked about this system and some of the challenges that we face, particularly as growth accelerates here in Utah. We're sort of a victim of our own success when it comes to that. And then Carla talked about what we stand to lose if we lose Great Salt Lake. And then it falls to me to say, well, what, if anything, can be done about it. I'm happy to report that it's all been solved. We can just wave a magic wand and suddenly all these problems would go away. The spoiler alert is that there really are no silver bullet solutions for Great Salt Lake. I think as we get through this presentation, though, hopefully you come away not too depressed and hopefully a little bit encouraged. But I want to start out by saying, listen, let's just acknowledge that the, see if I can advance my slide here, that the challenges are daunting, right? It's going to be an uphill struggle. It's going to be a heavy lift. The little scrawny guy there is Great Salt Lake. The very large sumo wrestler in the background is Kodishiki, a famous Japanese sumo wrestler, and that's the challenges that Great Salt Lake faces moving forward. So let's not pretend that these are easy problems to solve. Yeah, let's see. I'm spoiling my slides as I try to move through them. So I wanted to talk about just a few of the challenges I think that are things that make it particularly more complicated even to figure out what to do about Great Salt Lake. And the first deals with kind of the legal framework dealing with the Great Salt Lake and a recognition that we have a system of allocating water resources here in the West. It's based on what's called the prior appropriation system. And it does a great job allocating water fairly among consumptive users of water. The idea is that you divert water out of a natural ecosystem, we put it to what society has determined as a beneficial use. The challenge in that system is that water that's left in the natural environment is by definition wasted. And so unless the prior appropriation system adapts itself or in certain ways, then you have this perennial sort of pressure to take all of the water out of a natural system. As a matter of fact, in that system, a dry Great Salt Lake would be considered perfectly efficient because all the water is being diverted and all the water is being used for a consumptive purpose, right? Now, we know that that's not right. That doesn't sit right with us. Dr. Trentelman talked about this economic study that shows, the numbers vary between 1.3 billion, 1.6 billion in economic activity associated with that lake, very little water rights associated with that lake because of the way this system works. So that's a challenge, right? And the other challenge that our legal system imposes on us is that all of the water has been spoken for many times over. So all the water that's out there in the Great Salt Lake has been claimed by different people filing on water rights. Now, they're not using it all, which we're grateful for. We're grateful that they're inefficient, right? Or that they haven't figured out ways to take it all out. But they could, in theory, take it all out. And there's really nothing in the law, nothing other than some really sort of vague protections there that would say, no, you can't do that because we need to protect Great Salt Lake for all of these values that we place in the lake. So you start this conversation against a context where the legal framework itself makes this effort really challenging. The other thing is that it's piecemealed, right? So if you look just at the state agencies that deal with Great Salt Lake, Department of Water Quality, Department of Water Rights or Water Resources, Water Rights, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, all of them have different kind of responsibilities over the lake, but they don't necessarily talk to each other. They have their own set of regulations, their own set of laws that they have to govern under, and there's really nothing to sort of force them to talk to each other. And so one of the real challenges is how do we get them to talk to each other? Same thing for the various political entities that are there around the Great Salt Lake. So many cities and counties border on the lake. Do they talk to each other? Do they have shared interests, or do their interests, as they do sometimes, diverge? That's another problem, that fragmented kind of governance. And then lastly, I'd point out, we have something called the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, but the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council has a very tiny budget and really no legal authority whatsoever. It's legally constituted, but it can't pull any legal levers in order to protect the lake. So that's a challenge as well. And lastly, and Tage really alluded to this, and I think Carla did as well, most of the trends are in a negative direction when it comes to lake. You don't look out at the lake, you don't look at the elevation lines and say, hey, I'm encouraged, things are looking great, because they're not. We know that upstream demands are ever increasing, as Tage was alluding to. We also know that climate change, climate variability is a bit of a wild card. We also know that we're in a sustained drought, and that is having dramatic effects on the lake, right? So all of those things suggest that at the end of the day, we're confident there's going to be, that a positive outcome, right? I mean, it's a little bit like this guy on the trampoline. He looks like he's in for a painful experience in the not too distant future, and the lake is not dissimilar to that. So I wanted to say, fortunately, so lest you get too depressed, that progress is not just real, progress is real. It's not just real, it's real Salt Lake. See what I did there? So, but fortunately, there are some positive things that we can point to, and some of my fellow panelists have already alluded to them, and I'm grateful for that. But let's just talk about Great Salt Lake Advisory Council for one. Here's this informal body without any legal authorities, but what have they done? They've done enormous work in terms of drawing attention to the lake, growing public awareness about the lake and its values, its economic value, its ecologic value, and what are some of the challenges facing the lake. And they've been able to identify and cobble together funding to answer a lot of critical research questions, modeling, and different things like that. So we have this Great Salt Lake Advisory Council that actually done a lot to bring stakeholders together and to promote awareness about the lake. I can say, and some other panelists alluded to this, there's been a dramatic increase in awareness about the lake and in dialogue between stakeholders. I mean, Tage is talking about the lake today. I don't think 10 years ago, Tage was probably talking about the lake. I go to the water law and policy seminars and the water meetings that happen every spring down in St. George, and they didn't usually talk about the lake. But for the last 3-4 years, there's been kind of a standing panel presentation or a single presentation on Great Salt Lake. And that just speaks to that growing awareness. Now, still for most people in the state, it's fair to say it's out of sight, out of mind. But certainly among stakeholders, awareness is growing, and that's a positive thing. One of the things that contributed to that, I think, is the state recommended water strategy report that was really 3 to 4 years in the making. I think I can see a nervous tick starting on Tage's forehead, because I and Warren Peterson were sort of spearheaded that effort with many stakeholders. I don't know how many it was 30 or 40, but it was a very, very difficult process to sort of say, hey, what are the decisions we need to be making today, Utah, so we can have a sustainable future? One of the key recommendations out of that recommended state water strategy, and you can see the link there, you can pull it up today, is it said we need to find ways to protect the Great Salt Lake. It's important to our future. And that document, unlike most reports I've worked on, you put them on the shelf, it gathers dust, you put your coffee or your soda or whatever on top of it, and you don't think about it. That one continues to shape policy in the state today. And that we're grateful for that, because it was certainly painful to go through that process over time. We've also seen, and it's a reflection of the state water strategy, significant policy moves in the last few years. And I hope folks are encouraged by that. And it's hard, without the perspective of 10 or 20 years in the water world, it's hard to appreciate just how significant some of those moves are. But I wanted to talk about just a few of those. One, I ran a resolution in 2019, HCR 10, and it was a resolution to address declining water levels of Great Salt Lake. Now listen, in the political space, a resolution is a nothing sandwich, 9 times out of 10, right? It's what the legislature does when we can't affect active policy. We just say, hey, we think this is important, or hey, we want to draw attention to this subject. What was interesting about this one, as far as resolutions go, is that I think it was really the most coherent statement as from policyholders. So this is the House, the Senate, and the governor together saying, listen, declining water levels on Great Salt Lake are a problem, and we need to find something to do about it. And then it had this interesting piece, and I got to credit Marcel Shoup with the National Audubon Society. She really pushed for this piece, but it was a piece that called for a couple of the state agencies to convene stakeholders and see if they couldn't come up with some concrete suggestions about what could be done. They did convene that work group. That work group worked all through 2020, put a lot of time and energy into it, and came up with detailed recommendations, again, available at that link, and I can't go into it. They didn't come up with any more silver bullets than I have for you, but I think that report, which was released last year, represents kind of the best available current thinking on what can be done in terms of helping Great Salt Lake. Not over the short term, but more over the long term. What are the most constructive things we can be working on? And so I think it represents an important statement of the state's goals and strategies moving forward. We've also seen some other pieces that I think will ultimately be part of a solution when it comes to the lake. One is watershed councils, a bill that I ran in 2020. Watershed councils are really just informal stakeholder groups that get together to help solve water scarcity problems outside of litigating it in court, is probably the best way to understand them. And as a state, we decided, hey, it's important to facilitate those. Some exist already, they've grown up organically, but we also want to create a framework for them at the state level. And one of the things that that does is sort of says, hey, statewide watershed council, one of your responsibilities is Great Salt Lake. It also envisions ultimately a Great Salt Lake Watershed Council made up of representation from all of the watersheds that feed into Great Salt Lake. Ultimately, any solution on Great Salt Lake is going to need that kind of framework to be successful. We have a state water policy, and I just point out that Great Salt Lake was called out in that state water policy as important to protect the water quality and quantity flowing into that lake, right? We need to do something about it. Again, a recognition coming in from the legislature that this is an important policy moving forward. Critical piece of legislation passed in 2020 dealing with water banking. The banking is simply the idea, like if you can get by without a water right, or if you can get by with half of the water that you'd normally use, can you take the water that you're not using, can you put it into a bank so that it's not forfeit, it's not lost, but it's available to other users. And then other users can come to the bank, whether it's an agricultural user or it's an environmental user, then come to the bank and say, hi, I need some water short-term, can I lease it out of the bank? It's an important innovation that's happening in a lot of places. Indeed, here in Utah, in a few situations, though not really classed as a bank, but we wanted to create a legal framework to recognize that you can do this. And honestly, again, it's very hard to see a permanent solution to Great Salt Lake that doesn't involve some sort of water banking. Just give you a quick example. Let's imagine that an agricultural user way up in the headwaters gets a little more efficient. They don't need as much water, so they can save some of the water, right? Well, I can't really go to them as a lake interest and say, hey, can you get that 1,000 gallons, down to Great Salt Lake? That's not going to work. It's just a drop in the bucket. But through a bank, could you maybe have a bunch of those buckets and you combine them all together? And then somehow, this is a big challenge, $1 million question, how do you find a way to shepherd it down where the water is really needed to say Great Salt Lake? Again, it's hard to see a solution that doesn't envision some sort of banking. Banking has some real advantages because it's a market-driven solution that provides real value and protection for existing water rights. So that's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to see a Great Salt Lake water bank. We're testing this at very small scale around the states, but it's one that holds enormous promise and one that we need to continue to explore. And let me lastly just say, in terms of broadening the conversations about Great Salt Lake, I ran a big economic development reset bill this year, working with a lot of stakeholders. It was a multi-year process to sort of update Utah's economic development strategy. And one of the pieces that I'm proud of in that is that we pulled into that some things about, notice that one of the explicit goals of state economic development strategy moving forward, it's no longer just about jobs, jobs, jobs. Those are important, right? But we need to make sure that we secure healthy and resilient ecosystems for current and future generations. And notice that they also pull in language in terms of the metrics of success that we set up for this new Economic Development Commission. We want them to be talking about efficient and optimal use of water resources, recreation, water for recreation, and for protecting and restoring healthy ecosystems. Again, no guarantee that this solves any problem associated with Great Salt Lake. What it does guarantee is that Great Salt Lake and our natural resources will be part of these important conversations moving forward. So you can see, okay, I'm having trouble with these. You can see we're going to solve a problem, just like this guy with the hose is going to solve that fire there. But hopefully we're making progress. I'm going to allude to just a few more things before I wrap up and take any questions that the group may have. I do try to conclude my presentations with a note of optimism, and I love this quote from Wallace Stegner. He said, one cannot be pessimistic about the West, and you could put Utah in there. This is the native home of hope. You need to be optimistic. You need to find ways to be collaborative and to work together. And fortunately, our state has a proud history of doing that. So let me just say, I've got just a couple more slides to go through, but this one is the black tracing that you can see on that is lake elevations over time measured since settlement. So as long as we've been here and been measuring the lake, it's reflected on this graph. And then the color bands are kind of interesting. That deals with a lake health study that was done by the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. The green band is when the lake is meeting the vast majority of its beneficial uses, whether it's again, ecologic uses, economic uses, all these other uses. When the lake is healthiest and it's meeting most of those uses, you can see that green band. And then you can see deviations away from that band. So if you go either both on the high side and the low side, so if you get a little higher, you can impair some of those uses, or a little lower, but it still meets most of its beneficial uses. You get into the orange, that's kind of the sketch zone. We start to see more impacts. Fortunately, we never tested the red. And we're hoping and praying that this year that we don't test that red. We are likely to see levels in Great Salt Lake this summer that have never before been measured. We will approach that red line in a way we probably haven't ever done before. We're hoping that there's some resistance bands there and we don't break through them. But the good news is that mostly the lake has been meeting its beneficial uses. And one of the really encouraging things, and one of the reasons I'm not so pessimistic about the lake, is that the best available modeling that's been done on the lake suggests, number one, there's only so much you can do. The lake is at the mercy, and we're all at the mercy of big climatic trends, and a sustained drought is a sustained drought, and there's not much you can do. But that same modeling study that was done by Jacobs Engineering, and the models now held with the state, also suggested that at the margins, if we do a modest amount, if we find ways, as Tate suggested, to put a little more water back into the lake, that's a challenge. But if we can do it, it helps keep the lake. The model suggests it helps keep the lake in that sustainable, either in the yellow or the orange sort of level. So we can make a difference. It does increase the odds that we can have a positive future for ourselves and for Great Salt Lake. And I find that encouraging, right? It means that it's not completely hopeless. We're not helpless. Concrete steps that we take today can shape the future of the lake in a positive way. So, boy, this is touchy. All right. Let me just talk to, I'm just about done here, but let me talk to about some other things that we can do, some other things in the future. They aren't part of policy, but they are likely going to be part of any solution moving forward. One is we have to find a way to fund this kind of effort for Great Salt Lake. It has to be significant because none of this is cheap, and it has to be sustainable over time. And if people think that the cost of doing that is expensive, consider the cost, as Professor Trentelman was talking about, of doing nothing. Owens Lake, I mean, it's like we're talking about like $4 billion, $3.5 billion in sort of partial ineffective mitigation for Owens Lake. It's a 20th the size of Great Salt Lake. And it's not right next to a population center where the prevailing winds take all of the dust right into the population center. So we have to find ways to fund this kind of work up front, and they need to be sustainable over time. We've got to be careful about things like reuse. Reuse is typically bandied about as a great conservation tool, right? So when you divert water out of a system, use it, put it to multiple uses, right? That's all great, unless it's increasing consumption of that water. Right now, a lot of water that's flowing into the Great Salt Lake is treated sewage effluent. Now, people might think, well, that's horrible. It's not. We'll take the water in any form. I'll take the raw sewage. And the lake happens to be, as a terminal lake, extremely good at processing nutrients, just as terminal lakes are all around the world. So we need the water. And if you treat the water to such a high standard that it creates a secondary market for that water, the other consumptive uses come in and want to buy that reused water, that ultimately hurts the lake because it decreases yet another source of supply for the lake, and an increasingly important source of supply for the lake. Ag water optimization. We need to work with the agricultural community to find solutions that work for their community and work for the lake at the same time. Those options are out there. We just need to explore them and to fund them. As I said, better legal recognition of the lake and more effective tools for actually dealing with it. Secondary metering, which was mentioned by, I think, both other panelists, is key, but it helps us manage that outdoor use. We're talking about water that's put on our landscapes that in many cases, it doesn't have an economic value. It has very little lifestyle value. We don't even use half that grass, right? I mean, how much time are you spending in your park strip dancing around or kicking a soccer ball? You aren't. And that's true for a lot of our lawns. We have these great big lawns. We're only using a tiny portion of them. So I'm not saying we got to get rid of lawns, but we need to find a way to get rid of those park strips and not have everything in sprinkling systems that, that's just wasting a bunch of water. Utah State did a study that suggests we have more acreage in Kentucky bluegrass than we do in alfalfa. Well, at least the alfalfa, we can feed it to animals or sell it to China, right? But all the grass in our yards, I mean, look, it has value. It keeps the dust down. It's nice. It helps cool things down a little bit. But the reality is we're out of control with it. It's everywhere you look. And in many cases, it's so wasteful. I mean, I walk around my neighborhood late at night where we have unmetered secondary. It's crazy. I mean, the amount of water that's going, and sometimes I'm glad it's going down the ditch and hopefully getting to the Great Salt Lake, but in many cases, not getting to the Great Salt Lake. It evaporates long before it gets there. And effectively, that is truly wasted water because it's water that's going to benefit nothing. And we just need to fix that. I mentioned basin scale water banking. That's a long-term solution that's going to take many, many years to put into place. But again, hard to see a solution for the lake that doesn't involve that. I'm optimistic. We look at Lake Urmia, which was mentioned as kind of a sister lake to the Great Salt Lake in Iran. It's almost exactly the same size. It's bisected by a causeway. It has been the source of one of the world's great environmental, ecological disasters as that lake has dried out. Unfortunately, with some good wet years and some real sustained effort by the government to reverse those trends, we see Urmia coming back. We hope that can last, but we need to see the same kind of thing happen here in Great Salt Lake. And again, I like to conclude with this slide. What I love about Utah is we have a unique ability to work together. Nowhere in the West is there a community as effective at working together to solve problems as the water community here in the state of Utah. Tage is part of that. Many of you are part of that. You go to those meetings. We identify problems and friction spots, and we try to work collaboratively to resolve them as best we can. The state is very good at that. And I love that pioneer spirit, right? Of working together to solve these difficult problems and taking the long view. It's not about, pioneers didn't move out here thinking about today, right? They were thinking about what was going to happen in 5, 10, 50 years from now. We need to have that same sort of vision. We need to have that same willingness to work together to solve these difficult problems. The lake is as difficult a problem. Saving Great Salt Lake is as difficult a problem as you will see on the policy landscape. But it's going to take everybody's best thinking and working together to find meaningful ways to protect it and sustain it into the future. That's my presentation. Thanks. Open to questions.
Thanks, Timothy, for that great and inspiring presentation that you just gave. A question that just came in, can the Great Salt Lake buy water rights? Utah legislature buy rights for the lake. While expensive, it may be a tool in our belt. This is coming from Guy.
It's complicated. So right now, the options that are available to the state in terms of, say, the state acquiring water rights is there is some provision for state agencies to acquire water rights, but it's only specified state agencies. So for example, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands can't acquire water rights, but the Division of Wildlife Resources could, but only with money appropriated for that purpose from the state legislature. That is not an authority that's been widely tested, but it's one we should maybe explore here.
Good. And let me remind our guests that are with us to put any questions you may have in the Q&A. And let me ask you another question, Tim. From your presentation, you really focused on what the state has been doing to recognize the Great Salt Lake, that it's an integral part of who we are, our geography, if you will, of the region. And the next step is action, right? And you gave a few different ideas of how this action could take place. The water banking you mentioned. In terms of legislation, what do you see as the next step for policy with regards to Great Salt Lake?
I'm not sure, and it was interesting. We had a fairly quiet session when it came to Great Salt Lake, when it came to water this last session. And one of the reasons is because of those heavy lifts, say in the water banking sector, we need proof of concept on some of those things. And maybe what we need is more funding, and maybe what we need is to complete a lot of the critical studies so that we understand what's going on. We also continue to need to emphasize to people to educate people on why they should care about the lake. If they don't care about the lake, then all is lost. And interestingly, if you go out there, if I go out in my community and start saying we should care about the lake's ecosystem, or you should care about lake industries, nobody cares. The only thing I've really found is when you start to say, hey, this could affect you. This could affect your family's health as that dust comes off the lake. it could decrease your snowpack, so your skiing's not as good. That then suddenly it touches people in ways that that they haven't paid attention to before. So I think there's going to be a little bit of staying the course. We need to continue to further these discussions, but I'm not sure there's anything that just jumps out that says this is a policy change that we need to make today. I think one thing that concerns me is that the state engineer's office is allowing new applications for groundwater drilling in the Bear River watershed today. That's a problem, right? Because that water is mythical. It's not really there. It's being used by somebody, right? It's being used by the lake, or it's just being used in so many different ways. And so I think we need to figure out smart ways not to make the problem worse. But I'm not sure, again, that there's like a clear policy fix right there right now. Julie, I can't hear you.
Thank you. So we're going to open up the forum to additional questions that can come in, and I'll just throw these questions out, and between Dr. Trentelman and Mr. Flint and Mr. Hawks, Representative Hawks, you decide who wants to take the question. So we have, in your opinion, why are we not seeing more xeriscape landscaping in new residential subdivisions? And this is coming from Janae Thomas Watson.
I can take a shot at that. It's a great question. And we've done a few surveys over the last few years and found that Northern Utahns still highly value their landscapes in their yards and want to protect them at a lot of cost. And so what we found to be much more effective than well, and then let me add two. Xeriscape is a patented term from Colorado that has been used and misused so much that the true meaning of that type of landscape by definition has really varied. What I'd suggest is what we've found most useful and most received by Northern Utahns is this concept that we can, just as Tim just mentioned, we can substantially reduce our turf areas in our landscape footprint and still have enough lawn, if you will, to do the activities that we want, and instead put a lot more beds with a lot more drip irrigation in them. And what we're finding is the next generation of adults, the youngest adults now, are finding that look of a landscape actually more agreeable than yards with fence to fence turf. And so I think we're going the right direction there. Xeriscape by definition is one that is to use different landscape components to use a lot less water. It was never meant to be cactus and gravel and a few cow heads laying around. That whole Tucson look won't, at least we haven't had that take any kind of traction here in Northern Utah. But we can accomplish the same thing very much so by just reducing that turf significantly. Clear down to 25% of your total yard footprint being turf, the other 75% being beds and drip irrigation will substantially reduce your usage.
A follow-on question to that from Scott Quinney. Tage, are there funds available for park strip to xeriscape conversion?
Yeah, hi Scott. Yes, we actually are working with the state of Utah, and each of the 4 large water districts in the state of Utah are funding programs in water conservation applications. And one of them is this flip your strip concept. Weber Basin up here in Northern Utah will be participating this next year in a flip your strip concept. You can go to our website starting next month at weberbasin.com. Click on the conservation tab, and there'll be a way for you to participate with us in taking those park strips out. Now, an important component to this is check with your city. We have some cities that still have ordinances that require turf in your park strip. And we're working with them as fast as we can go to encourage them to take some of those types of restrictive ordinances back off and allow us to still beautify the area and use a lot less water.
Hey, Julie, I just wanted to follow up with Tage too. I do think cost remains a big challenge. So if you think about your average home and you put it in, to put in turf is going to cost you, I don't know, $1,000, right? Depending on your lot size, maybe $1,000, and then you put the irrigation system in for another 500 or something like that. If you were to xeriscape that or put substantial portions into drip, not only is the annual maintenance higher, but so is that upfront cost. So it might be 5 or more. It might be, if you really did it fancy, it might be 10, 15, 20, something like that. So there's cost there. And I've had the same conversations with developers. I've said, why don't you xeriscape more? And even churches, why don't you xeriscape more? And it's because it's cost. It's just cheap. The cheapest thing to do is just throw the grass in there. And that's why they do it. And so unless there's a cost-effective alternative or watering that grass becomes prohibitively expensive, you won't see a lot of innovation in that space. Even if people, as Tate said, if you give them the preference, do you like landscape A or landscape B? Well, I like B. Well, it'll cost you twice as much. Well, you just lost 90% of the population.
Couldn't agree more with that. And the only thing that's even more expensive than that is retrofitting your large turf areas later on to a xeriscape type of a landscape. That's even more expensive. So great point.
Okay, a couple more questions have come in, and one's from Richard Heyer. He's asking, has Weber Basin considered making incentives for water-wise landscaping, much like smart sprinkler controllers? And there's a follow-up question from someone else about incentives still available for smart sprinkler controllers.
Yes, great question. Yeah, we look at it every day. We have a staff here that does nothing but water conservation concepts and applications. We talk about it every single day. The answer is we have not gone to the point of, say, that Las Vegas has done, where they're paying people to take turf grass out of their yards. We've not done that. Here's why. We can apply the money that we would spend on that to secondary metering that I talked about earlier and get a lot more bang for the buck in water conservation. So you'll see us concentrate on metering secondary water for the next few years, but you will also see us over the next decade come back with these kinds of more, they're not draconian, they're really just big change type ideas of changing yards and helping you pay for them. The price per acre foot, if you will, the price of that savings per acre foot goes way up as soon as you start paying someone to change their yards out. One other thing I will mention is that in incentive programs is we are currently funding 50% of a smart sprinkler controller for any resident within the Weber Basin District. So those 5 counties in northern Utah and many of the other counties as well down south. We will fund half of your sprinkler controller cost if you will buy one that actually adjusts to the weather. So if it rains for a couple of days, it will shut your sprinklers down. That type of a controller, many of which are available now at Home Depot and other places, we will pay half of that through a rebate program.
Very good. Another question is, can you update us on the progress of the Bear River diversion, the pipeline, the proposed fielding, Temple Fork, Whites, and refuge dams, and how will it impact the wetlands?
I'll take first shot at it. I think our other speakers probably might have a feel on this too. The condition of the studies right now is there's been a preliminary study completed that talks about alternatives for developing water on the Bear River. If the Bear River project were ever to deliver the amount of water that's anticipated in the law, it was going to require additional storage, and which means reservoirs. And where they might be located is still to be studied, but preliminary studies have looked at all those sites you just mentioned, Julie, in the question, as well as many others. And what form that project will take in the future, I think it's going to be something that we haven't anticipated yet. That's Tage's personal opinion, because of the environmental constraints that might be put on any kind of a traditional water project that used to build big dams and big storage and pump stations and pipelines. The impact to the Great Salt Lake, that same study that I referred to earlier that talked about the 11 total feet of impact to the lake and its each of its components. The Bear River project, if it were just to be built as anticipated early on and divert water of the Bear River would add another 6 to 8 inches of a reduction to the lake's level. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that the mitigation efforts that'll come along with this project will make up all that it might impact it if the project's ever built.
Okay. Representative Hawks or Dr. Trentelman, do you want to weigh in on that question at all?
Sure. No, I'd really second what Tage is saying, and there's no one better positioned, quite frankly, to understand that than Tage. And I think it's, it was a project conceived with kind of the way we did water infrastructure a generation ago. We're in a very different world today. The needs are still there, but as Tage said, it would be, I think, foolish to assume that it would look anything like historically these big projects would look like. It's one big dam that stores water somewhere. I mean, there's all sorts of concepts that are worked in here. If you store water higher, you get less evaporative losses than when you do store it at a lower elevation. Deeper is better than shallow. There's a whole bunch of things. But from a lake perspective, it's really hard to see it, unless it's part of a banking type component. It's hard to see it as anything other than a negative for the lake, because what it means is more, generally speaking, more upstream consumption. So it's hard not to see it as how does it not impact the lake in a negative way.
Exactly. And I would just add the main thing that I would add, not only to that question, but to these issues more broadly is, and this actually gets also to a couple of the questions that I saw in the questions about, like what can normal Utahns do about all of this stuff? I think in addition to trying to live skinny where water is concerned, especially in our yards, that the other most important thing that we can all do, that we need to be doing, is to do our homework on these issues and to do our homework on, so where is the Bear River Development Project at right now, and who are the deciders, and should I be talking to those folks about my concern? Should I be asking questions? Should I be letting my representatives know how to represent me on these issues, for example? I think that one of the most important things that we can do as a population is to really do our homework about, so what are the issues that affect the lake, and then what are the solutions, and then who's working on those solutions, and can I have anything to say about that, right? So how does my state representative feel about these issues, and how is she likely to vote? And in my case, I have a female state senator and a female state representative, so I get to say she, and making sure that they know how I would like them to vote, because otherwise I don't get to complain that my representative isn't representing me if I haven't told them how I feel about things, right? But I can't really do that unless I'm also doing my homework. And right now, there are tremendous resources out there because of the kinds of studies that have been being done on the lake and on these issues. And so I would really encourage folks to do your homework, to look up the reports that can help with these issues. And then, if Tim is your representative, you need to let him know how you feel about these things. And, if Rosemary Lesser is your representative, you need to let her know about how you feel about these things. And not just at the state level, but also, do you know what your city says in terms of how much turf you're supposed to have in your yard? And like where are the corners where you start getting in trouble if you take out more than that? And is that a problem? And if that's a problem, then who is your city council member that you should be saying, why do we still have this in place? And can we fix that? Right? Those kinds of things, making sure that our decision makers are being held up to the level that we all need to be thinking in terms of when it comes to dealing with the lake. That's my soapbox, and now I'll stay.
What I'm hearing is that we all need to be more civically engaged, right? That's good. There's one comment from Cheryl Walksack in the Q&A. She says, I think you need more educational advertising to convince people that they can have some green grass using 80% less water. I use my secondary water 1 to 2 times per week for 30 minutes. It looks the same as folks around me that water every day for over an hour. They do not believe me.
It's a great comment, and I couldn't agree more. There's a couple of things you have to keep in mind. One is it's training your lawn, just like you do anything else. If your lawn roots know that it needs to go a little deeper to get the water, and it's only coming every so often, it will adapt and stay greener longer with less water, and we know that. I can tell you, particularly in the areas where they have secondary water in this area, Representative Hawks is not wrong. When you walk through his or any other neighborhood in northern Utah, you can find yards that have root zones 1/4 inch thick or deep. That's as far as they have to go in that swamp to get the water. We have applications. We watch and see how folks use their secondary water. We have some secondary water users, not many, but we have some that put down the same amount of water that it would take to grow rice. On their bluegrass. So point well taken.
Good.
So I would have follow up on that one too. I do think it's so interesting. Yeah, I think Tage, what is it, 300 inches in your worst case scenario? You've got people that
we got a couple 400.
Some high flyers. I mean, that's wet side of Maui. I mean, just put it like that's tropical rainforest and beyond, and people are putting it on their yard. Now, I will say the knee-jerk reaction as a policymaker is, well, its price signal is the only thing that are going to make a difference with consumers. So if we put tiered systems in and we meter them and then we charge them based on that tier, right, so that progressively they pay more, then that's what's going to be the solution. And there's elements of that I think they're absolutely true, but I do think there's such power in this idea of secondary metering where Weber Basin installed 1,000 meters and they didn't change the cost. They used federal grant money to do it. They didn't change the cost for anybody. All they're doing in that case is providing the consumers with more information, right? This is what you're using relative to what you used last year. This is what you're using relative to somebody that's using a similar size lot. Dramatic change in behavior simply by providing them with information. I will say to the original question, can you just educate people more? Tage will be the first to tell you, educating people on conservation is extremely expensive and not always effective. But secondary metering, for some reason, that particularized bit of information, particularly relative to maybe it's a keeping up with the Joneses, I don't know what it is, that seems to have a dramatic effect that's vastly outstrips smart timers, any other little technology you can configure. That's kind of an empowering idea, right? We give people information, they make more responsible decisions.
Very good. We've got one final question in the Q&A that I'm going to add to. So there's 3 things here. And it's from Sean Buse, who sits on our committee that organizes this forum. And he says, to also help with awareness of Great Salt Lake, is there interest in 2 concepts discussed recently? 1, renaming Legacy Highway and the West Davis Corridor to Great Salt Lake Scenic Byway. And 2, putting the Great Salt Lake on the license plate. And I'm going to add this one in there. Can we not get our weather report individuals on channel 2, 4, 5 that has the map of the Great Salt Lake that shows the Great Salt Lake at its high water state, that as an informational piece, that we show it as it actually is so people can become more aware? So could you address those 3 things?
Sounds like a Dr. Kenneman question to me, those first 2.
I think it's really important for us to think about the visual imagery of the lake. So I'm like jumping on the 3rd one instead. And anywhere where we have those visualizations, maybe we need paired. This is what it's supposed to look like, or this is like at least this is the natural average or the historic average. And this is where we're at now, you know, so that, and thinking about other places where we could do those visuals, like in the airport, you know, you just flew over the lake, you know, it looks different now when you fly over the lake than it used to. And here's why, you know, and some of those kinds of things might begin to make differences in some ways.
I'll add,
Making differences in our culture of how we think about it. Go ahead, Tim.
oh, sorry, Carla, I didn't. Yeah, I'll add a few, and then maybe Tage might have some thoughts. But I think anything that connects the people to the lake is a good thing. We used to have a historic connection that we didn't have, but that we don't have today. Trains would go out to Saltaire daily. People went out there, they partied, they swam, they had a good time. You know, people were just connected. A lot more people used to duck hunt than do today. And that would take people down to the lake and expose them to the lake in different ways. Today, it's like Antelope Island, you know, if you're lucky, that's kind of your connection. So anything we can do, I think, to connect people to lake makes a lot of sense. Somehow we need to connect people's behaviors to feeling like what they do today can make a meaningful difference in this much bigger system. I thought it was interesting last year, and I don't fault water providers for this, but you know, we had the driest 9 months on record from January to October, bone dry. We'd never seen anything like it. Explains why we have these incredibly dry soils right now. And yet last summer, did anybody on this call, did you hear any water shortage stuff, any cutbacks, there was none. And the reason there was none is because we have such a great system of water storage. The reservoirs were pretty full from the year before, but somehow we've got people thinking ahead. And here's the problem. When a water provider like Tage says, we're gonna start later with the secondary irrigating, and we're gonna cut you off earlier, or we're gonna ask that you not water during the day, people scream bloody murder. They act like you're taking away their Second Amendment rights. And so we do need as a people to kind of understanding those connections and understanding that this is water for our future. This is water for our kids. This is water for our health. This is water for, we have to take those steps. We don't have the luxury of continuing the status quo.
I'll just add good news and bad news here. Bad news is that I still have neighbors, as Tim alluded to earlier, I still have neighbors that couldn't care less about the lake. And in fact, I've heard many tell me over the years that clean water that makes its way to the lake is just wasted water. And I couldn't disagree more. But that attitude is out there, and it's out there in a large percentage. Here's the good news. Good news is that the next generations coming up have studied how to save the whales in the Pacific Ocean as kindergartners. And they have a much higher awareness of environmental issues going forward. And I think the good news is these next generations are going to pay more attention to it. And if they get some of these visual clues and some of these promptings along the way, from whatever sources, they will adhere to that much quicker than the past generations have. So there's some good news in all this. To the weatherman idea, we work with the weathermen quite a bit, and so when you see the percentage of normal snowpack charts that you see on the weather broadcast, that's largely because we are providing them to them. But it's just messaging, right? They have to do it quickly, and is it enough messaging, or does it send the wrong message? I'll give you a good example. This year, we're at 75% snowpack up here in northern Utah. Our forecasted runoff is below 45%. And it's because those dry soils that Tim was just talking about. But that's too long. That was 3 sentences in a weather forecast that they're going to say something for about 5 seconds. So messaging is a tricky thing out there, but there's hope on the horizon in terms of how the public views the lake, I believe.
One of the things that's really important about that in the research that I did is that the folks who had grown up feeling connected to the lake, the folks who had been able to go out and play on the island, or had been able to go floating, or those kind of things, whether it was on the south end or on Antelope Island or any of those places near the lake, those folks grew into adults who not only felt very attached to the lake, but also felt very protective of the lake. And so one of the things that we parents and grandparents can do, if we want to continue to grow that generation that Tage was just talking about, is make sure that we're taking our kids and our grands out to play at the lake. And, you know, laughing with them about the smell and about, you know, the bugs. And there's all kinds of places that we take our kids to that have bugs, and yet we don't make a big deal about them, you know, if we're getting mosquito bites up camping. But yet somehow when it's the lake, then it's like this other thing. So we need to help our kids like get past that. And there are lots of cool resources for kids out there these days too, that that can help with that process.
Thank you all. We've come to the end of our time period here, and I'm hoping that maybe Representative Hawks, next year's session, we can rename Legacy Highway and think about that license plate. It's that branding and awareness that we're trying to bring to the forefront. But we really would sincerely like to thank Mr. Tage Flint and Representative Tim Hawks and Dr. Carla Trentelman for being on our Drying of the Great Salt Lake Forum today. It's been a very enlightening and exciting exchange of ideas, and I have found so much information that I am taking away from this that I will continue to educate myself more on the Great Salt Lake, which whenever I pass, I put my hand over my heart, because the Great Salt Lake has been a definite part of my life, and I want to see that it remaining healthy for a variety of reasons. A big thanks to Guy Latendra, who is heading the Economic Forum for the Walker Institute. A big shout out to the Walker Institute for helping to host this, and to Becky Stromberg, who really is the behind the scenes making everything work. We also would like to thank Jordan Kirkham for being on our forum with us today to make sure all the logistics and our IT was functioning properly. So watch your email boxes for upcoming events. And again, thanks to our panelists. We appreciate all the insight and the information that you shared with us. So thanks again to all of our attendees for taking part of your time today to spend with us, and keep the Great Salt Lake great. Thank you.